Hey, what are you watching?
Hey, you can't eat those, they're mine.
Yeah, I can. It's a free country.
So today we're going to be making a video that we've actually been asked to make for a number of months now, which is comparing the concept of freedom in Denmark, where we live, and the US, where we're from.
And of course, keep in mind that we're going to be talking about our own personal experiences, but we're also going to use facts and data and metrics to really kind of illustrate this incredible topic. So let's get started.
So freedom is obviously a pretty abstract subject. So we went to freedomhouse.org, which is an advocacy and nonprofit NGO based in the US that looks and scores different countries around the world. And from that, we're able to get different scores for the US versus Denmark. To start with Denmark, they actually get a 97 out of 100, with a lot of notes on this that are quite positive, talking about the independence of the judiciary, the strong rule of law, the ability for individuals to have freedom encompassed in law across Denmark. Though the one part that they did get dinged for is, in particular, some of the lack of freedom for immigrants and newcomers.
And of course, Denmark is rated as free. In the US, also a rating of free and a little bit of a lower score at 83 out of 100. Now, the US is renowned for being a robust democracy, having a vibrant political system, and a strong rule of law tradition. In the most recent year of the report, 2021, the United States was dinged for having criminal justice issues, obviously extreme partisanship in the United States, and the threat to political norms, most notably probably the January 6th insurrection. The report also notes problems with immigration and the treatment of asylum seekers in the United States, as well as growing disparity in wealth and inequality. One thing that really stood out to me is that it did show a slipping of scores in recent years. 5 years ago, the US ranked at an 89, and 10 years ago, it ranked at a 94. So even though it's an 83 now, it's still a free country. It is a freedom-loving country and noted as free, but I think that there is some work to do, and things have been sliding in recent years. Now, taking a deeper dive into the report, when it comes to Denmark, the report notes a very high trust in government, very limited corruption, and a high rate of freedom for individuals like women and LGBTQ people that are living in Denmark. Although it does ding Denmark, as you mentioned, for the treatment of asylum seekers and immigrants and newcomers to the country of Denmark.
Yeah, and as you look at the parts where obviously Denmark gets high marks for its rule of law and things like that, and the dings on the treatment of immigrants and newcomers, I think a good example of this that also kind of shows into how Denmark thinks of freedom at a political and a cultural level is the controversial anti-ghetto law that came in a couple of years ago. At a high level, the concept of this one is to try to drive assimilation of immigrants and other newcomers into Denmark by driving people to resettle out of higher crime or higher concentrations of non-ethnic Danish areas to try to drive assimilation and try to avoid having areas that the government has called ghettos. The idea is this is going to help drive economic progress, economic freedom by trying to avoid concentrations in this way. It's controversial because obviously it treats freedom as two different ways. I think in Denmark, the government here sees this as trying to drive economic freedom and seeing that assimilation is a virtue, it's a plus, and something that drives a collective freedom in this way. On the other hand, it's a law that basically is telling people they can't live maybe where they want to live, or they can't live amongst people in whatever ethnic group they happen to come from, or people from a similar nationality where they came from, either themselves or others in their family history. So I think it's a good example of how it's an example that Denmark treats freedom as something that's maybe more of a collective freedom, even at the expense of individual freedom, since it's driving towards what's perceived as a societally positive outcome.
Yeah, and I think that idea of collective freedom is actually something that overarching is really the difference between freedom in Denmark and freedom in the US, which tends to value the freedom of the individual. The idea in the US that the government would tell anybody that they need to pick up and move or they can't live around people of a certain ethnic background would be, I can't imagine that. It may be the kind of thing that would have happened years and years and years, 100 years ago. And the US has a longer tradition of immigration. So it's interesting to kind of look at this contrast between how ethnic neighborhoods are in the US. In big cities especially, ones I've spent the most time in, like New York and Boston, Philadelphia, you've got the Italian market, Little Italy, the West End of Boston. Like, you've got these ethnically Italian neighborhoods that are now, just kind of part of the city. But you've always kind of had these ethnic neighborhoods. You know, even in LA, Koreatown, for example, like, you know, it's the idea that, yeah, you want to have a Korean church and Korean supermarkets and the best Korean in probably the country in Koreatown in LA. So the idea is that, you know, in the US, it's always kind of been that freedom to, yeah, live where you want to live. Something like this would just be completely unimaginable, but the report does cite it as something where that's a bit of maybe a problem when it comes to freedom, but it's really a problem of how both countries, and really highlights the difference between how both countries view freedom.
And digging deeper into the US, I mean, there's certain areas, especially constitutionally, where freedom is enshrined. I mean, there's the Bill of Rights with the kind of the 10 core freedoms that were part of the Constitution from 1789. You have states like New Hampshire where literally their slogan is live free or die. So it's kind of a little bit not just the ethos, but just the drive of what the US is in this way. At the same time, the things that the report cites as being kind of the negative of freedom in the US. Again, the things talking about racial biases, especially in the criminal justice system. Well, obviously, a lot came through the protests that came through the last several years and the results of the George Floyd shooting and other things that have come to the fore in this way. A huge example of this that's brought up is partisanship. It's kind of that political divide that's maybe in the most worst way expressed in the January 6th insurrection, where you literally had a group of people that thought that they were coming to the Capitol because their freedom to pick their president was being trampled by whatever powers were at bay. So I think this is kind of where the report cites the negative sides and the backsliding of US freedoms.
Yeah, I think when you make people think that they have all of this individual freedom and they can express it in any form whenever they want to, even in the form of violence, that can come up. And, you know, in the political discourse in the US, obviously it's become more partisan, but you also see that idea of individual freedom in some of the hottest and most, you know, intensely debated issues like gun rights and abortion rights and the right to marriage and things like that, you know, we're constantly dealing with and re-dealing with. But I would also argue that especially when it comes to sort of the racial inequality and things like that, you know, obviously it's something that the United States is constantly dealing with, but even something like the protests and the things in the last few years, you know, you can have a report like this point out things about the justice system, but I would also argue that that's a freedom that now, because it's been exposed, is going to expand freedom. So I think that's one thing I notice is that in the US, you know, freedom is something that is constantly having to be protected, but constantly being evolved and expanded. In America, we know that we're not perfect. In the US, we know that we're not perfect and that it's our job as individuals, because we value individual freedom, to make sure that we're constantly improving. You know, we're founded as a non-perfect union, and we're founded to, you know, and that founding principle, it persists through all of us to make sure that we're constantly driving towards a more perfect union and more freedom for all.
Yeah, and that freedom piece in the US, I think, is a really interesting one, is that balance between individual freedom and collective freedom, because obviously there's a tension between the two. I mean, this is maybe shown very well in things like the gun rights debate, where you essentially have a way that gun laws are being interpreted in the US now to essentially say that individuals can more or less do what they want. Well, obviously there's a collective downside to that, which now means that people may get shot and do get shot a lot more because of this. This is kind of a debate that's happening, and obviously where we side on that divide is probably ones that would value the collective freedom over the individual freedom in that way. You know, you see other debates in this. Abortion in some ways goes the opposite way, where essentially you have an interpretation where now kind of this collective concept that freedom, individual freedom on being able to choose, is something that's not being respected as much in that way. But that's the tension I think you have in the US in that conversation on where that lies in between the two. Is it collective freedom or individual freedom in that way? And obviously there's a bias towards individual freedom just in the general background of how the US has kind of interpreted these things over time. I mean, someone, you know, hearing things like, oh, it's a free country, it's a little bit cliche and a little bit of a joke, but that is kind of in the background of everything that we do.
Yeah, the idea that you can just do whatever you want because it's a free country. I also think that it's true what you say, and that's why it seems to outsiders a lot, especially around Europe and especially in Denmark, that, well, why don't you just do like whatever and fix that one law? And the process does seem longer in the US, but I think that's why, because we're so careful and so protective of individual rights that making a sweeping decision that impacts everybody in the country are things that sometimes only happen once per generation. And I know that seems crazy to a lot of other people, but that's just the way that American freedom is really so individual freedom driven that it's hard to understand for some others.
And I think that's the core contrast with Denmark. Again, I think we said it a few times in this one, but in Denmark, and I feel like this is true in a lot of Europe actually, that collective freedom is sometimes more highly valued than the individual freedom. I mean, in Denmark, maybe an obvious way economically to see this is just the higher taxes that are paid. There's obviously, I think for a lot of people, you can be able to make more money in the same sort of role potentially in the US because you'd pay lower taxes. But the flip side of that is being able to have a situation with a stronger safety net, more robust investments in education and in health that allow it for people to maybe have maybe a little bit less economic freedom, but the entire collective is in a stronger place in Denmark. That's the perception or the intent of what happens in this place.
I also think that when it comes to that idea of partisanship, it can be difficult for a lot of our Danish friends to understand where that comes from, because I think in Denmark, you really value kind of that collectivist thinking almost. The idea in Denmark that political conformity or that political consensus, whether it's in government or, kind of the idea that you're going to get along to move along, it kind of trumps everything. Where I think that there is probably more diversity of political thought that is culturally diminished a little bit by that idea that you want to kind of drive towards consensus all the time in Denmark, at least politically or in the way that you're thinking about a lot of these issues. Whereas in the US, you're really taught to push your individual viewpoint and push your individual politics. And it's okay to, have a lot of diversity in thought. Part of that too, I think, is the fact that the United States is just a huge country with a lot of diversity. Our 330 million citizens are all very diverse.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe kind of one of the interesting things politically between the two different countries. In some ways, it's almost ironic that Denmark's a country where it's 14 parties, 12 parties have mandates in the current parliament. I mean, I'd almost argue that there's almost a broader difference in political opinion as you go from somebody on the far left and Enhedslisten versus somebody on the far right that's maybe in more liberal or some of the other more populist parties here in Denmark versus even the furthest right to left that you go in the US. But at the same time, there's that value in Denmark of being able to come to an agreement. I mean, in a lot of the political debates, there's certain cases where, let's say right now in the government, they could very easily push through some policies because they have enough votes for it, but they want it to be a more collective decision. They'd rather have something that gets 3/4 of the Folketing to agree on as they put something into law because it'll have more staying power. Whereas in the US, if you have the power, you kind of go for it politically. It's a little bit less consensus driven, but once you have the votes, you take them and you go forward. It's an interesting difference in how that's kind of, that collective versus individual plays out in that way as well. And obviously that has impacts on how freedom is perceived in both ways, because again, if you have the ability to do so in the US, that's individual freedom. You press kind of your right and your privilege to go do that, whereas there's a bias against that here in Denmark.
And there's a little bit of, I think, sort of cultural pride in that difference of opinion or that difference of political opinion, whereas I do think there's more of an idea that you want to, again, like you said, strive towards consensus, even if that means that you're constantly sort of finding a middle ground throughout the entire process. In the US, it's not so much like that.
So obviously this is a bit of a loaded topic as we get into it, and I think something we want to bring up as well on this, especially because so much of you in our audience are Danish or live here in Denmark, is maybe standing up for our homeland a little bit. I mean, something that we definitely see in reading the news here or seeing what gets covered here is there's certainly a bit of a bias in looking at the US and kind of the negative sides of these freedom debates that come up. And there's obviously a bias because the coverage is very much focused on what happens in the big cities in the US, or kind of on what's the kind of the worst things that come out of the news in the US that make it here in Denmark. And we want to maybe have a little bit of a plug to say that not all the US is what you actually get on the news here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Americans, probably the majority of Americans, live in suburbs and small towns that are more similar to most of Denmark. But you really only hear news and the things that are startling and shocking that come out of, New York or maybe Washington or, maybe those Florida man kind of stories where it's like you're hearing like the worst things that come out of the US. and really kind of paint a bad picture of what freedom looks like in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it on a map, you can see that the U.S. would stretch from Lisbon to the west of Ukraine and from North Africa to the Scandinavian Peninsula. It doesn't even include Alaska and Hawaii on there. As you said, 330 million people. It's almost similar in population to the whole EU here in Europe. So I think there's that diversity, and there's also that there's these interpretations of freedom that happen all over the place. And that's one of the beautiful things about the US, is that you're able to find something that makes you feel comfortable or at home anywhere that you go in there. And it's kind of a nice thing about that. And I think the other core part in the US is that it's kind of culturally a place that we air our dirty laundry, that it's a place that we put these things out on the table and debate them. And in some ways you can see that American history is all about the rabble-rousers that say the unpopular things that suddenly are driving for greater freedoms along the way. So while it looks ugly and it looks like we're backsliding, in some ways I disagree with some of the Freedom House things on there, because I see some of these things as actually signs of progress towards freedom, because we're talking about racial injustice in the criminal justice system. It's not like it's a new thing. It's been there for decades, if not centuries.
We talk about all of these things constantly in the US, and I know I don't maybe, I mean, I do follow Danish news and Danish politics, but I definitely consume more American media. You know, I don't always hear some of these hardest societal issues debated as openly in Denmark, but in the US, yes, it does get exhausting that we're constantly talking about them. But again, it's because we're bringing them up. We want to advance rights for people. We want to advance freedom for people. And you're right about the dirty laundry. I think it's like, we know it, and sometimes it's like, you know, we can call our baby ugly, but you can't. You know, we know it. We know we're not perfect, and we like to try to move the ball forward. The other thing that I think this report from 2021 sort of fails to capture is, if it's updated, and obviously it will be for a reflection of 2022, in the US midterm elections, you saw a real strong rejection of those kind of anti-democratic forces and a return to the idea that we want more bipartisanship and we want government to work better to move freedom in a way that respects kind of the rule of law that you know, exists in the Constitution, and to kind of, you know, anybody that was denying the 2020 election was fair and accurate was basically not elected to office. And that's a good thing for the US. And I think despite all of the, you know, drama that we may bring to the table sometimes, when it comes to freedom and doing the right thing, in the end, we do get it right. So that said, I know that it's kind of fun to go along with American stereotypes, but if you want to see our thoughts on some different stereotypes of Americans and Danes, you got to watch this video right here and let us know what you think of that video. Thanks for watching, everybody. Enjoy your freedom.
Hi.